that I wanted to share a little bit of the history of how we got here today. And so this is about pretty close to the 30th time, over 30 years, that we have been here as guests of the Embassy of Kuwait and the ambassador over the years. And I'll never forget a reception that was taking place, and Dr. Mohammed Al Sabah, when he was the ambassador. And Lynn and I, it was a winter night, all sorts of diplomats and ambassadors in line, and we're about, 10 people ahead of us still. And Ambassador Mohammed Al Sabah, he spots Lynn and I. And before we've even gotten in front of him, he goes, "Reverend and Mrs. Story, it's so good to see you." And as we approached, he says, "You're bringing the children back to my embassy." And we said, "Well, you've been so gracious, we didn't want to just insinuate ourselves upon you once again." And he looked at Lynn and I and he said, "You must come to my embassy." He said, "It is now tradition, and you bring light and life to my embassy when you come." And so that's what he thought of the kids that came to the embassy during those times. But how we first came to the embassy, when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, my wife and I and family were out in California, and on the day of her dad's funeral, Kuwait was invaded by Iraq. And we returned to Washington, D.C. about 2 weeks later. This was in the last part of August. And what day was it when Kuwait was invaded? August 2nd. And so it was August 2nd that her dad's funeral was. And when we returned to Washington, D.C., my wife and I were praying and saying, asking God, in a very simple way, how can we reach out to the people of Kuwait and to the ambassador of Kuwait? And we were in a house not far from here and just praying, just a simple prayer. And all of a sudden, you know how God speaks to us in our consciences, in our minds. I hear this phrase, "Pick up the phone and call the embassy." I picked up the phone and I called the embassy. And Ambassador Sabah's, Saud El Sabah's secretary said, "Well, I cannot ask the ambassador to come to the phone right now. He is with the President of the United States and the Emir of Kuwait at the United Nations." And I said, "Oh, I fully understand." And she said, "But if you would write him a letter and letting him know that you're praying for the people of Kuwait, I'm sure he will respond to you." 2 weeks later, I received a letter and then a phone call from the ambassador saying, "I would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." And I went to the embassy, and it was the embassy and residence at that time. And I walked in and he said, "I am in the open area here." He had set up his desk outside of his office near the fountain in the embassy residence. And he had set up his desk. He says, "I will not go back into my office until my people are safe at home." And we sat down and we talked together. And he said, "I don't know whether my family is alive or dead in Kuwait." And we spoke together, spent about 45 minutes together. And one of the things that he shared with me was, you know, you have those moments in life that are just, they affect your life. And he looked at me and he said, Reverend, you are the first Christian leader to ever reach out to me. And I was so grateful that I was able to do that. And then we kept sharing, and we prayed for his family. We prayed for the people of Kuwait together. And then at the end of that meeting, he had a TV interview with Ted Koppel on a program called Nightline. And my wife and I were watching it in bed that night, late at night, and Ted Koppel was nasty. And I looked at my wife and I said, I was a whole lot nicer to the ambassador. We had a much better conversation together than Ted Koppel did with him. And so after that, 2 weeks after that, I get a call from his office. And his secretary said, the ambassador would like to meet with you right away. Can you come today? And so I went to the ambassador's office and we spoke, and he said, I met with the President of the United States, and he did not feel the support of the Christian community in the United States for what he wanted to do. And Ambassador Saud al-Sabah said to me, he said, but I told him, he said, I just met with a reverend 2 weeks ago who said he was praying for your country and your people, and he was having people all over the United States pray. And the ambassador said, I want you to write a letter to the president. And I went back to where we were living at that time, and Lynn and I, on an old Selectric typewriter, we wrote a letter, composed a letter to the President of the United States. And the ambassador said, I want you to get it to General Scowcroft, who was the, the National Defense Advisor to the President. Anyway, he said, the President is leaving today, could you get it to him? And so I took the letter down to the White House, and we also called a dear friend out in California who was the pastor of a very large church, and he had a big conference with about 5,000 people from all over the United States. And I called his office, and we'd done conferences together before we moved here when I was pastoring in California. And I called his office, and they said, he's just getting ready to conclude the conference in prayer. I said, would you tell him the ambassador asked for the prayers of Christian people all over the United States for his Muslim country? And he stood up in that large gathering, and they got the message to him just before he stood to conclude the conference. And the next day, from what we understand, the embassy received many phone calls, the White House received phone calls from all over the United States from that one phone call. One phone call. And then after that, that's just the preparation. After that, Sheikh Saud, we met half a dozen times during the war. Jackie was here during all of that time. And he invited Lynn and I to be his guests and the guests of his government in Kuwait. And so right after the war was over, Lynn and I had the privilege of being his guests in Kuwait and meeting with over half the cabinet. And as a result of that, we just had an ongoing relationship, and that is part of the reason that you're all here. But I want to share an event that I haven't always shared that is very important to me. Ambassador Al Sabah wanted to make sure that we went to the evangelical church in Kuwait City. He said it's a church that was built by medical missionaries who intervened. I think it was a smallpox epidemic, and helped save many in the royal family from that dreaded disease. And so we went there, and on a Friday morning where they had their services, the pastor asked me to sing. I volunteered, actually, as a baritone soloist. And I'd been singing a song called "I'll Rain Upon Your Desert, Saith the Lord." I'm your healer, your deliverer, and your friend, and my love for you will never end. While I was singing that song, all of a sudden there was thunder and lightning, and without exaggeration, a rainstorm moved in off of the Gulf over Kuwait City. Everyone took note of it. And when we returned and walked into the ambassador's office, the first thing he said to Lynn and I was, "Reverend, it rained while you were in my country." He said, "I felt that that was a most significant omen of your visit." He said, "It has not rained in my country since before the war." And he said, "Secondly, it never rains in my country at this time of the year." And once again, he repeated the phrase, "I felt it was a most significant omen of your visit." That is the history. And I am so honored that we have that history together. And it's lasted for the relationship with the people of Kuwait and with the ambassadors here have lasted for these 30 years. I am so glad that you and the ambassador and the previous ambassador made it a tradition. Made it a tradition.